Welcome to dkameraTV today with the Nikon D3300. The D3300 is the new entry-level DSLR from Nikon, and it replaces the D3200, which was first introduced about 1.5 years ago. Not a lot has changed on the D3300. On the outside there are a couple of slight redesigns. The grip is slightly different, and there's a slightly different button layout on the rear of the camera. What is most striking when looking at the 3300, however, is the new kit lens. For the new kit lens, Nikon has employed something that we've known from kit lenses of mirrorless cameras before, which is a parking position. So this is actually a collapsible lens, which, when it is in its collapsed status, is a lot shorter than the previous kit lens. Only when extending the lens by pressing this button and twisting the zoom ring, it reveals its true size. So this is an actual benefit, and it will probably save you some space in your camera bag. As for the inside of the camera, the D3300 still sports a 24 megapixel sensor in what Nikon calls the DX format, which is equivalent to the APS-C format in the DSLRs of other manufacturers. However, this is a new sensor. It also comes with a new image processor, and it does without an optical low-pass filter, so it promises extra sharpness in the images. And as we have seen in our image quality test on dkameraTV, indeed up to 1600 ISO, the image quality of the 3300 is very good and sharpness is very high. ISO 100 to 12800 is what the sensor supports, and ISO can be pushed to 25,600 as well. The AF is face detection, of course, as with every DSLR, 11 AF points, and the center point is a cross-type sensor, so this means that with the center point you can also use the camera in portrait orientation. In live view mode, as with other DSLRs, the D3300 uses contrast detection autofocus, and in our tests the contrast detection AF was rather slow and not really very practical. Also, what is a bit of a pity, the 3300 does not have an integrated focusing motor in the body, so it doesn't work with older lenses. On the rear of the camera there's a 3-inch display with 921,000 dots. That's enough to accurately preview the images you've taken. The optical viewfinder has 95% coverage, which is basically standard in entry-level DSLRs, and has 0.85 times magnification, which is pretty good, so there's nothing to complain about here. The shutter goes up to 1/4000th of a second, also quite standard, and the maximum frame rate in continuous shooting mode is 5 frames per second. The camera also comes with a video mode, as most DSLRs have today, Full HD 1080 pixels, with now 60 frames per second. On the D3200 the Full HD mode was limited to 30 frames per second. All that comes in H.264 compression format. There's also an integrated flash, guide number 12. Unfortunately there's no integrated Wi-Fi or GPS in the camera body itself, but Wi-Fi and GPS can be added with external modules. The camera is slightly smaller and slightly lighter than its predecessor. It now weighs 410 grams without battery and memory card, but of course with battery and memory card it will be a slight bit heavier than that. At this point in March 2014, the price of the D3300 is around 500 to 550 euros, depending on where you look. So let's take a closer look at the D3300's body. We will also take a look at how the buttons work, what they do. We will take a look at the guide mode, which guides a DSLR beginner through all the functions and some of the basics of photography, and we'll also take a look on the menu system and the displays of the camera. The body of the D3300 is similar in styling to those of other Nikon models. So for those already familiar with Nikon DSLRs, the learning curve shouldn't be too steep at all. But for the beginner, the D3300 isn't always that intuitive. But let's take a look at the body of the camera. On the front, as already mentioned, one of the first things that we notice is the new kit lens, which is a lot shorter than its predecessor thanks to the clever new locking mechanism. In its collapsed state, the lens is a lot shorter than the previous kit lens, and in order to extend it we need to press the locking button here on the focusing ring, and when we want to collapse the lens again we have to press the button again. Also on this side of the lens is the switch for autofocus and manual focus, as well as for the image stabilizer. On this side of the camera body we have the lens release button, the FN button, which unfortunately can only be set to a couple of functions, and the flash pop-up button. Here we have a selection of connectivity ports. Video, USB, HDMI is under this flap, and here under this flap something that you won't find on a lot of entry-level cameras: microphone input and a plug for a remote control. The remainder of the front of the D3300 has a very sleek and functional design. There's not a lot going on except for the autofocus assist light. And on this side of the camera there's the compartment for the memory card, for the SD card. On top of the camera, of course, there's the on-off switch, there's the shutter button, a button for exposure compensation when extending the lens and switching to preview mode, or rather to information mode, as we're currently using the viewfinder. Pressing this button will activate exposure compensation, which can then be set with the thumb dial on the rear of the camera. Here we also find an info button that changes the display information on the screen. Of course, in the info mode it just gives you the option to turn the screen on or off. However, in live view mode there are a lot more of information overlays that can be cycled through. Then on the top of the camera there's the direct movie record button, and of course the large mode dial, which besides the standard picture taking modes also sports a couple of scene modes as well as the guide mode. We have the pop-up flash on the top, as well as a flash hot shoe for an external flash. On the rear of the camera, of course, there's the huge 3-inch screen and the viewfinder. The viewfinder also has a diopter correction wheel. Next to the viewfinder there's a button for auto exposure and autofocus locking. The thumb dial that we already mentioned. There's the live view button, which switches between info screen and live view, and when we switch to live view mode we see the red box, which indicates the area that the contrast autofocus is focusing on, and this can be moved with the 4-way controller to the right of the display. In the middle of the 4-way controller there's an OK button to activate settings. There's a button to cycle through the various drive modes, such as continuous and self-timer. And there's a button to delete images when we're in playback mode. Playback button is here. Here's the button to delete an image. Below the playback button is the menu button, and that leads us directly to the camera menu. There's a sub-menu for the playback function, a sub-menu for the shooting functionality of the camera, for the main camera setup, a retouching menu which can be used on images already recorded, as well as a recent settings menu which gives you, as the name gives away, settings you recently chose in the menu. While we're in playback mode, the plus button will magnify the image, while the minus button will zoom out and bring us to the overview. In shooting mode, this button acts as another information button. It will display a quick info that explains the camera's current mode. And this info button activates the quick menu, which can be used to switch the most important shooting settings. So let's take a look at the guide mode and what it can do for users of the D3300. The guide mode is meant for beginners and for those unfamiliar with a camera, and it explains a couple of things. For one, in shooting mode and in the guide mode shoot submenu, there are two more submenus, easy operation and advanced operation, and these will give you a couple of shooting scenarios and explain the settings that have to be made on the camera in order to take certain kinds of pictures. You can choose, for example, whether you want to use the viewfinder or live view, and then the camera picks the correct settings and you're all set to go. This is very nice for beginners, and by using the guide mode you will quickly learn which settings affect the image in which way, and at some point you'll be ready to use and to make all these settings on your own, and maybe to step up onto a more advanced camera model. Pressing the menu button we get back to the guide mode, and this guide mode also gives us info on how the playback function of the camera works, on what the different setup functions do, what the different camera functions will actually do when we change them, and it also guides us through all the retouching functions of the camera. As for the info screen, it gives a very detailed preview and a very beautiful preview of the current settings, and depending on the mode that we chose, the preview screen also changes. For example, when switching to aperture mode and turning the thumb dial over here, the nicely animated aperture changes, and of course in program mode the dial will change the camera program, and with it the aperture and the shutter speed. So this is also a very nice way to give you clear information and precise information about what the camera is currently doing. So in that regard, the D3300 really is a very good entry-level camera. For the owner of a D3200, the question might arise whether it's worth to upgrade to the 3300. Well, first and foremost, this is a question that everybody has to answer for themselves, but we can give you a couple clues. Basically, between the two cameras, not a lot has changed. Yes, the 3300 is a bit smaller and a bit lighter, but does that really make that big of a difference? Inside the 3300 there's a new sensor, still 24 megapixels, but it comes with a new image processor and without the low-pass filter, so it has a slight edge in image quality. And in the video mode, you can record Full HD video with 60 frames per second, which wasn't possible with the D3200, that was limited to 30 frames per second. So if any of these changes does make a huge difference for you personally, then it might be worthwhile for you to upgrade to this camera. But if we look at it overall, the differences between the 3200 and the 3300 are too marginal to say, yes, it's definitely worth upgrading. We'd rather recommend, if you own a D3100, that you upgrade from that camera. However, as a camera to upgrade to from a compact, and in general as an entry-level DSLR for beginners, this is a very good camera which delivers absolutely beautiful images, great video, and has the added benefit of the guide mode, which explains to you how the camera works and some of the basics of photography. So this is definitely a very good entry-level DSLR, which we can wholeheartedly recommend to someone who is new to photography or new to DSLRs. That was our hands-on video on the Nikon D3300. We hope you enjoyed it, and as always you can find a full review of the camera only in German, though, on dkameraTV. And if you're not already a fan of our YouTube channel, we look forward to seeing a lot of new subscriptions. Thanks for watching.